Philip and I's job is, we've been given a task to facilitate these. We're not in charge. We are making sure that, all 41 voices get heard, and we go through a process that's been laid out in front of us. There's been some talk about the process changing, and we're fully prepared to adopt that once that responsibility is told to us, from the mayor's office. We also recommend that the mayor's office and the city council have some further conversations with some timelines coming up as well. So, that's kind of my take in it, and I don't want to speak for Philip, so I want him to be able to give a high-level overview of those conversations before we get started. So, Philip?
I'm not sure I have a lot to add. I thought that was a great summary, Tony. So we understand that conversations are continuing between the mayor and members of the council, and look forward to working with any changes in direction that may come from those conversations. For now, we're pressing forward with the agenda as initially laid out, and thought the discussion was really great at the end of our meeting last week, once we got into small groups and then back in the larger group, and look forward to more of that today as we're getting into more of the policy content with Kira.
So again, thank you, everybody. And I hope everyone had a chance to review the minutes. And so we would start the meeting officially and approve the minutes for the week before. So all in favor of approving the minutes, say aye, unless you notice any discrepancies.
Tony, I've been told that one City of St. Paul staff member, Bryn House, ought to be added to those who were in attendance at the meeting. So there's one revision to the minutes. Sorry.
Okay, so noted. Anything else in the chat that people notice they can put up there? Otherwise, approval of the minutes with that one addition change. All in favor, we assume. I heard the ayes. If there's any nays, let us know. Say now or forever hold your peace. Any nays? All right, the minutes are officially adopted from the previous minutes. Secondly, we had worked, and the announcement of I think Tony's going to come on of a folder to share materials on. So if people miss minutes, they can go back, recordings, and also just educational materials. So with that, I would turn it over to Tony.
Thank you, Tony, for that. I worked to create a Google Drive folder that contains folders for each meeting. In each meeting folder, we'll include things like approved minutes, link to the YouTube, eventually a transcript, as well as things like PowerPoints or other resources that were shared during that meeting. There's also additional folders in there, including one folder that contains supporting documents. So that'll contain things like the language of the St. Paul Rent Stabilization Ordinance, the community agreements, things like that. There will also be two folders that contain resources on rent stabilization. One folder will be citations that are used, that we cite in our presentations based on the research that the Kira team has done. And there's also a folder titled Stakeholder Submitted Documents, and that's where we'll include any resources submitted to us from anyone on the committee. We will not be vetting those or doing anything, but we will put them into that folder for anyone's perusal. Anyone on the committee will have read access to this folder. If you have resources that you would like us to put into that folder, please email me. And I don't know if you want to be CC'd on that as well, Ed. And then we will put that into the folder. I will put the link to the folder into the chat right now, and then we will also include it in the email that we send out that includes the post-meeting survey.
So I'm just reading in the chat to make sure. Arlene, did you get what you need as far as understanding that with access?
Yeah, I think if it's in the email to us after the meeting and if it's in the chat, okay, that's fine.
So as you get a chance to go through it over the next week, if you have more questions, you can email ahead of time so we can maybe come up with some answers before the meeting, or we can have time to do that as well. So moving through that, we're getting to the meat of this meeting pretty quickly. We're going to go over the post meeting, the survey. And is that you, Tony?
No, that'll be me.
Oh, sorry, Ed.
That's all right. All right. So yeah, as you'll recall, you all received an email with a short survey again after last week's meeting. And so what we'll do is very briefly go over the answers that you gave in a summary form, and then you will be able to offer any questions that you have about this. So the first question we asked, which was requested by one of the members of the task force, was whether you live and work in St. Paul. And you can see the answers given you. There were only 18 respondents to the survey this week. And one of the respondents did not decline to answer these particular questions. But you see that virtually all of you who answered are working in St. Paul, and the majority, of course, are living in St. Paul as well. That's the breakdown there. The second question that we asked was, what was your most important takeaway from that first week of learnings that we did? And the most common response was a variation on the sort of basic fact that there is a history of rent control out there to learn from, and that participants felt that this was important and allowed for a kind of source of information for the group as it moved forward. Another cluster of answers related to the importance of the emergency conditions that generally gave rise to rent control in the past, including high rates of inflation and high housing price situations. And so five people mentioned that. A couple of people mentioned that they were that their takeaway was related to the impacts of rent control. Two other people, their takeaways had to do with our internal processes in this task force, and then there were four other responses that were hard to categorize. And I will say that it's important for you to look through the raw answers, which we will make available to you, the full answers, for you to get a good feel for people's responses to this. Again, we're summarizing them and categorizing them for you here. This is sort of a short term. The third question that we have was, we asked you whether there was a new or surprising thing that you learned. And by far the most common response, about half of you who answered mentioned that what was new and surprising to you was this idea that there had been previous waves or generations of different forms of rent control. And you add on to that three other answers that focus more on the cyclical nature of the political support for and against rent control over the history of the 20th century mostly, and into the 21st. A couple of you were surprised by the extent of the preemptions that exist in a lot of states around the United States that don't allow local governments to enact rent stabilization. A couple more had a reaction to the conditions under which rent control is enacted. And again, this was a reference to the emergency conditions or the conditions of inflation. And then there was one commenter who felt that I had been biased in my presentation last week. So those were 15 responses to that particular question. Table 4 shows the answer to the question, was there anything that was covered that made you rethink your perspective or your assumptions about rent stabilization? And 7 of the 15 responses were, in essence, no, that there was nothing that made them rethink their position, or a variation on that was that several people felt that their previous understanding had been reinforced by what they had seen in the presentation. And then you see, again, a variation on answers related to a variety of rent control types that made people rethink what they had previously thought about rent control, and the examples of other cities. But again, there are a fair number of responses that were singular and so ought to be looked at in their totality. And again, we will be sending out the full responses in a couple of days. And that will, of course, make it onto the shared site as well. The last question that we asked of you was, do you have any questions that you'd like us to follow up on, either immediately or over the period of time that the stakeholder task force meets? And there were a few questions that clustered around property taxes and property values, a couple about inflation and its role. And then there were a couple of questions about the research sources that we used and the methods that those studies used. I will say that the answers to those kinds of questions would really get us into the weeds of the research quite a bit. I think what we're going to do instead is to put up into the shared drive all of the research that we have been relying on, so that you can follow up firsthand on some of the additional questions that you have. But there were additional questions that you had to follow up on that I can answer today. And so there are 4 in particular that I want to follow up on, because I think they relate specifically to things that were said last week and that are germane to our conversation today. So the first one was, one of you asked what the historical average rent increases have been in St. Paul. And I wanted to say that we are working on this. We have 2 research people working through the data. It's quite time consuming to put this data together, but we hope to have this information for you in the next couple of weeks, certainly before you start your full-fledged deliberations. We will be able to give you some fairly detailed information about rent increases in St. Paul over the past 15 to 20 years, at least. We'll be able to do that. So I wanted to mention that. A second question that we got was, we were asked to verify whether a study existed that showed that in Cambridge, Massachusetts, after the city ended rent control, that whether it saw a 20% increase in new development and an increase in property values. And I will say that that is a reference to a study that was published in 2014 in the Journal of Political Economy. And in fact, it did show that the number of permits for improvements and new construction increased 20% in the years following the elimination of rent control in that city. Now, that's not all of that is new development. This was permits for improvements and new construction, and the study doesn't really break it out. But in fact, that was the finding. In addition, that study showed that the percentage of units in Cambridge that were available as rentals actually increased by 6 percentage points after rent control ended. So this is some evidence that property owners had been taking some units off of the rental market during the period of rent control, and that they went back onto the rental market after rent control was over.
Hey, Ed, just to confirm this, when you say increase in new development and property values, it's all just related to multifamily development, multifamily rental?
No, it's not. This is
Okay.
this is an overall number of building permits. And again, as I said, it's not all new development. These are permits for improvements as well.
But it's not even necessarily just related to rental multifamily.
That's correct.
So really, you can't really draw a conclusion of rent control to these numbers. You could if it was just related to multifamily rental development. But as far as we know, a lot of this could have been for malls, for example, right?
Right. It was residential. It was all residential.
Okay.
But what we don't know is what percentage of it was multifamily.
Yeah.
We can assume some percentage was.
Yeah. So I think that's where, I'm sorry, just to make a comment, where I get concerned about some of these statements we make about equating this 20% increase in new development and we relate it to rent control when we don't know that to be the case. Because for all we know, 70% of that could have been for condos or single family home ownership. So I just think sometimes these conclusions that are being drawn aren't necessarily apples to apples, just stuff.
Right. We have to be careful about how we interpret these findings because we don't know what percentage had to do with multifamily. What else? And so there was, as I noted, an increase in property values. And again, this was across the board. And this was due to what the authors called both the direct and the indirect effects of rent control, decontrol. I would also say, and so I didn't speak about these findings last week because we weren't focusing on new development and the impact of rent control on development or on property values. But I will also note that there were other findings in that study, which also showed that there was an increase in median rents of 40% in the first 3 or 4 years after the end of rent control in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this was an increase in 40% for units that had previously been under rent control. The increase for units that had not been under rent control was only 13%. And then finally, the other finding from that study was that there was a, quote, sharp increase in resident turnover at formerly controlled units. For the 6 years after rent control ended in Cambridge, 33.5% of apartment residents moved on an annual basis. And that was a large jump over what had been the case prior. So that was the second question that I thought I could follow up on today. The third question related to a comment that I made last week, and the questioners said that I had mentioned that rents are almost always reduced when rent control is implemented. And then the person wanted to know whether those findings had adjusted for inflation or not, which is a great question. And it made me realize that I had been imprecise in what I had said. What I meant to say, and I apologize for not being as clear as possible. What I meant to say is that rents in rent-controlled units are almost always below those of uncontrolled units when there is rent control in a city. So it was a comparative statement about rents in a city that has rent stabilization. So I wanted to make that clear. And then the last item that I think could be answered immediately was there were a couple of questions about the reason for the end of rent controls in Massachusetts. I think a couple of people said that my answer to this question last week implied that politics played the largest role in the program being ended in Massachusetts or in Cambridge. And they wondered whether that was really truly the case or whether it was a case that the program simply had not been working. And so I guess I want to be clear about that. I didn't mean to merely imply it. I meant to actually state it, that in fact, politics did play the primary role in the ending of rent stabilization or rent control in Massachusetts. The state of Massachusetts had rent stabilization, rent control for about 24 years. And in the early 1990s, a small property owners association formed in the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, and they tried to address or eliminate rent stabilization in that city a couple of ways. And they came upon the strategy of bringing it before the state's voters to as a way of addressing the situation. And in fact, the votes from that election showed that in the 3 cities where rent control existed in Massachusetts, and that's Boston, Cambridge, and Brookline, nearly 60% of the voters in those cities voted to keep rent control. The votes to eliminate rent control in Massachusetts came from the rest of the state, those places that actually did not have rent control or rent stabilization. There are 2 other cities that had rent control for a few years in the 1970s. That's Somerville, Massachusetts, and Lynn, Massachusetts. And I don't know why they eliminated it. I tried to find out last week, but could not come across any evidence of what the reasons were for the elimination of rent control in those cities. And then finally, I will note that there are talks of reviving it in Boston and Somerville at this point. So that's the summary of last week's questions, and I'll turn it back to Tony Sana to see if you've got any additional comments or questions. Anyone has any additional comments or questions? All right.
Ed, there was one question that I think is worth addressing. There was a question of, was that an end to rent control or rent stabilization? And I think, at least for our purposes, we probably want to clarify that we're using those terms interchangeably, because other than cities like New York, different cities call them different things, but there's not a systematic program, well-defined difference between the 2 terms.
Yes,
Well,
thanks.
can I ask then, did it allow for rent increases in the Massachusetts program, or was it stable rents?
Yes, it did. It all rent control programs since the 1960s and 70s have allowed for rates of rental increase, and that's the way the Massachusetts law worked as well. Tony Sana, you're muted. Sorry.
Just kidding. Will these documents also be in the folder just for everybody to look at as well?
Yes, they will.
Okay. So if people want to look at them some more and have further questions, I hope that they can be emailed during the week and we can help us prep for the next meeting. And with that, I think Ed, it's back to you again about our learnings.
All right. Thank you very much, Tony. So we want to pick up where we left off last week. We were talking about rent caps and weren't quite finished with that conversation. And just for your quick review, we had mentioned that there were 4 primary approaches to setting rent caps that had been used in cities across the United States. The first is that rent caps can be determined by a rent board on an annual basis. There are not very many places that do that. That's a very time-consuming process and requires continually updating market studies, and so this is not widely used. A second approach is a flat percentage increase. This is the approach that was taken in the St. Paul ballot initiative, and it is used by a few cities around the country. The third approach is a variable increase, where the rents are allowed to increase at a different rate each year, and that is usually determined by the rate of inflation. Either the variable rate is tied exactly to the rate of inflation, or it's some percentage below or above the rate of inflation. So variable increase is the third approach. And then the fourth approach is a kind of a hybrid, which incorporates both flat percentage rates and variation. And so it's usually variable rates, again, tied to the to inflation, but with hard upper or lower limits, above which or below which the rate of increase cannot go. And so let's take a look at some examples. Now, there are a lot on this slide, and you'll be able to take a look at it in more depth later at your leisure. But what I wanted to show in this slide is the significant variation in approaches. And I want to highlight a few for you. So the city of Los Angeles, California sets its rent cap exactly at the CPI. That's the Consumer Price Index. So that's the measure of inflation. But they have a minimum limit of 3%. So their cap never goes below 3%, and their maximum limit is 8%. So no matter what the CPI is, it doesn't go any higher than 8%. So you can see Los Angeles is an example of this hybrid approach. San Jose, California, the second highlighted city on our list here, has chosen a flat percentage rate, and they have set it at 5%. Santa Ana, California combines the two approaches again and says that the rate of rental increase is going to be the lesser of either 3% or 80% of the Consumer Price Index. So some fraction of the inflation rate or 3%, whichever is less. The city of Washington, D.C. is a little more complicated, and they allow the Consumer Price Index, which is the rate of inflation, plus 2%, but they have a maximum of 10%. So their rate of increase never exceeds 10%. But for units that are occupied by elderly or disabled households, the rate of increase is kept at the rate of inflation, 100% of the CPI, with a maximum of 5%. So you can see Washington, D.C. actually differentiates by who is occupying a unit. And then if you look down to Trenton, New Jersey, they don't use the full rate of inflation. They use the housing inflation. There is a housing component of the Consumer Price Index. And so Trenton, New Jersey actually uses that as their measure, and they update it every 6 months, whereas in most places it's updated once a year. So again, a different way of going about it. And then finally, I would point you to the state of Oregon, which has set its rent cap at the rate of inflation plus 7%. So I think most people regard the Oregon rent control program as really an anti-rent gouging program, because this really does allow for rent increases of close to 10% on a fairly regular basis. And you can see that it really only limits the highest kinds of rent increases at this point.
Ed, can we take a chance to go back? We had a couple questions in there that I don't want to lose.
Sure.
One was where Minnesota is. So these are all by cities, I'm assuming. And so I don't, that question is where St. Paul is. Can you clarify what the St. Paul ruling is on that? And there's
Sure.
cities in Minnesota that have rent control?
Sure. So St. Paul is the only city in Minnesota with a rent control or rent stabilization program. And its rent cap right now is set at 3%. It's a flat 3% rate.
And another question is, how long have these controls been in place in other cities? I'm assuming that's going to be a really long answer because it varies, but if there's a short answer, you can share it.
The short answer is that it varies. And moreover, it's fairly common for cities to change their caps. Again, these programs are very sort of are very political in a lot of cities, and there are always efforts to relax or increase the tightness of these programs. So they do vary from time to time, even in a place that's had rent control for a long period of time.
And Ed, we have a question is like, these, it's not in there whether what the exceptions are, whether it's does it reset with the vacancy, or this is a hard number regardless of that? Is there any differentiation in there?
Right, and you're absolutely right. This is a separate question from whether there are exceptions to it. This is simply for those units to which a cap applies, what will that cap be? So this doesn't say anything about whether there are exceptions. We're going to get to that in the next set of topics.
Okay, and I think future research, I think the question is, and you might already have that coming at some point, just any research on cities that expired rent control. So if the team can have any information about that in the future. And then, Cecil's question about reporting, monitoring, enforcement, how and who. I'm assuming that's coming at a later date.
Yes, enforcement and administration of these programs is going to be our final topic after we get through these other.
Okay, I'm just going to get to a couple. There's a lot of questions, so I'm going to get to some. One was about displacement after rent control ended and vacancy. And so I'm just are these questions being recorded so that we can look at them also offline to come back and further?
Yeah, if they're showing up on the chat, then we'll have
Okay.
access to them afterwards.
Okay. Okay. So I think some of these are down the line questions, or that can be looked at and hopefully in future presentations as well. And the group is going to be writing them down. So if we don't get to it today, we'll make sure that we either get it on the agenda at some point to make sure it's answered. But in the interest of time, I think we've done a good job of answering the questions you've had. At the same time, I don't want to derail the presentation because I think some of these questions are being answered at a different time as well. So you continue?
Great. Thank you, Tony. All right. Appreciate it. The last topic that I want to cover on the topic of rent caps is the question of what are called rollbacks. And in this instance, what rollback refers to is whether or not the city sets the base rent to a date that is retroactive to when the ordinance began. And this is something that that happens in several cities and has happened in several cities, and in fact is something that the courts have upheld. They have upheld rollbacks anywhere from 6 months to 1 year, so that the baseline rents for subsequent increases are tied to a point in time prior to the implementation of the rent stabilization program. And this is meant to address that time lag between the announcement of rent controls and then the point at which they actually begin, to head off any kind of anticipatory rent increases by property owners. And I don't know the answer to that, Cecile, about how many cities do this. It's more than a couple, but I really couldn't tell you exactly how widespread this is. But that I bring it to your attention as one of the policy options that is in front of you here. So, summarizing for our talk last week and the little bit that we've had so far about rent caps, I think you can see the wide variety of approaches that have been taken to rent caps. It's probably not a decision that a city, would ever make in isolation from the other kinds of policy design options that you have in front of you. You'll want to think about rent caps in addition to what exceptions you might also think would apply in the city, or what kind of pass-throughs will be allowed, whether vacancy decontrol is in place or not, et cetera. So although we have isolated it as a topic so that you could learn about it, I think when you begin to deliberate about it, I think you want to think about rent caps as one of many decisions to be made simultaneously. And I think what I'd like to do is allow now you a little bit of time to speak with each other about this information, and ask you if you can sort of think for a little bit of time on what you think are the best reasons for going with a flat percentage increase or for going with a variable cap, and what the advantages or disadvantages might be of that. And Tony Damiano, if we could break folks into groups.
Working on that as we speak.
And I don't know if we want to take some of the questions in the chat.
Sure.
Just a second, but yeah.
Good idea. And then I'll get moving on this.
Okay.
Just one is D'Angelo's, thank you. Just what our definition is of rent. Is there clarity within the legal definition or what we're working on here? And D'Angelo's, if you have a comment about that as well, we welcome that.
Yeah, so the comment is about rent, and is the expectation that rent is all encompassing of the utilities, maintenance, and taxes and mortgage, or is rent a pre-described definition as part of the rent stabilization work nationally that we need to understand before we can make these comments?
Right. So I think most ordinances will have a definition of what they consider to be rent and what they're including in that. So that is a decision that can and will be made by a municipality. I think it commonly refers to the agreements that are made between tenants and property owners in the lease itself, and what is prescribed in the lease as the payment in exchange for occupation of the unit. I will say that some rent stabilization programs will also have something to say about additional fees, and on some occasions actually will prescribe limits to those additional fees, because I think one of the concerns is that one of the ways around a rent cap limitation is to shift more to a fee structure, a fee for use of different facilities, et cetera. And so some rent stabilization programs will address that issue as well.
Does St. Paul have a working definition in its current policy or ordinance that was submitted?
You know what? I don't offhand recall that. The language for the program is it will be up in our shared drive, and it's only 2 pages long, and so it's something we could check out for you very easily and very quickly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Ed. Don't want to have the rooms. The rooms are all ready whenever folks are ready to go into the room. But obviously, feel free to answer more questions too.
All right. I'm not sure. We have so did rent control become an ordinance at the same time we were able to? So I think the voters approved the the ballot measure in November, and I think the ballot measure itself said that the program would take effect May 1st. I hope I got that date correct. So the program has not quite taken effect yet, and but that date is approaching. All right. So why don't we break into the smaller groups so that you can have this conversation about rent caps and about your perspectives on that, and the advantages, disadvantages of flat percentage increases or variables. All right.
Tony, am I supposed to join a room too? Did you want me to join a room?
It's up to you. It just had me assign everyone.
Oh, okay. I just said no, but I might jump into one. See, depending on how it shakes out.
I was going to ask the same thing, but not jump into one this week.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I probably won't be jumping into a room. So
Yeah. I'm guessing the folks who are still here maybe stepped away from their computer or not, but if Kevin, Ian, Bryn, Dua, or David, if there is an issue for joining a group, let us know. Otherwise, I think y'all are free to join your groups.
Yeah, I will not be joining a group as well. Thank you.
Are you part of this city?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to skip the groups for today also. I'm city staff.
Okay.
Yeah, city staff here as well.
Okay. Yeah, it's worth, John, maybe we can talk about like the role of city staff. Are y'all just here to listen, or is that the main function? They just want folks to listen?
Yeah, that's my goal here.
Okay. Okay. So all the people, I guess, that are not in groups are city staff. Is that what we're basically saying?
The one person who is a member of the stakeholder group is Kevin Pranis from the laborers.
Oh, okay. He might have stepped away from his computer.
Yeah, but everybody else is city staff.
Okay.
If it's helpful, City Terrence, we could introduce ourselves to you too, so you have a sense of kind of like who we are again, and kind of like how we connect to this work. If that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm down for that. Just want to note that we're still on the live stream right now too. So we can do the live stream announcement if y'all want to. That's fine with me. But just wanted to note that.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. So yeah, but I'm cool with it if y'all want to introduce yourselves for sure.
I'm happy to start. I'm David Gorsky. I work with the St. Paul City Attorney's Office, working on this effort. So glad to be here.
Right on.
Hi, sorry, I was getting my camera on. I'm Bryn House. I'm the Director of Operations for the City Council.
Awesome.
Hi, my name is Dua. Oops, sorry, Bryn. My name is Dua, and I'm the legislative aide to Councilmember Jalali.
Gotcha. Tell her hey. Cool. Thanks for introducing yourselves, everybody. So yeah, I'm C. Terrence, Director of Community-Based Research at Kira, and helping facilitate this whole thing.
my name is Malik. I'm program coordinator over at Cura, and I'm a support staff for this group. Nice to meet everyone.
Cool. So there's a couple like groups in there, Tony, but I think it's fine.
Welcome back, everybody. Ed, are you still available?
I am, but I've been talking to myself on mute for the last 20 seconds.
Okay.
So welcome back, everyone. Thank you, Tony. And I'm wondering if there are some of the conversations that you might want to share with the full group before we take a break at the top of the hour. I think there's an opportunity if some of you had an interesting or especially compelling conversation in your breakout group that you wanted to share with the rest of us, raise your hand and feel free to do so. Otherwise, I think what we'll do is probably take about a 5-minute break and then come back.
Just, since there was a question about the 3%, how did they come up with it? Being, and I had someone else saying it is the I don't want to say it is, I guess what did you say, the most conservative rent control right now in the country is a flat 3%. But how did they come up with that 3%? Do we know? Okay.
I can provide an answer.
Yeah.
So we saw this, and Ivory put it in the chat too. It's the average increase in St. Paul over the past decades have been a 3% cap. So those have already been put in place. Why we chose that 3% cap is because we saw that a lot of households of color, Black households, Indigenous households were seeing a rent increase that was going way beyond that. So they were seeing hundreds and hundreds in rent increases. So this policy was drafted to one, follow that trend of this is just the average cost, average increase, but it's also going to protect a lot of people of color and Black people who oftentimes aren't being recognized when making these policies. So that is a little bit about why that 3% limit was put up. It could have been higher, but then it would not have directly affected people of color or Black people in that process as well.
And any of our, if is any of the data that we've had, has any of it had demographics in there, in those cities?
In terms of who is living in the units?
Yeah, affected by rent control or, average increases and things like that.
Right. No, that kind of research is a little more difficult because in addition to getting the research on the rent, you have to get research, you have to get data on the occupants as well, which is much more difficult. So there isn't a great deal of research on the occupants.
And Rosa, I think, at some point, maybe you're free to email the group of like you said, like you did your research and talked to renters. So, just getting more information on how you came up with that would be great to share with the group on that data, because I think then people could see it before them, firsthand.
We also have our resources from the study that we did. It focuses on Minneapolis, but what we were able to do some breakdowns. Again, this is without rent stabilization, but we were able to see which demographic groups were seeing larger or smaller rent increases. And I don't know, Ed, if we'll get to that at some point, but that's a resource that we put in the folder at a minimum.
Okay. One of the things before we go on break, I really want to, and I see Robbie has his hand up, but I think one thing that I really heard in our group was, the definition of rent is really key. When you have your businesses, it includes CAM, right? So, can you include your taxes and your pool use and your parking and your electricity? Is that all encompassing, or could that be all separated? So having a really good understanding of what rent is and how it's defined here, I think will end up being a part of the final decision, because it affects people in different ways. I think people that want assurances that we're not going to get a runaway train want to know that, some of the costs, have to be passed on. And then some, if we look at equity, some business are in positions to take on some of those costs as well, if we're looking to, build a more equitable community as well. So, Ed, we have 3 questions I see here. Are we okay with trying to get to them before the break?
Sure, let's do that.
Okay, Robbie?
Thank you. I just wanted to mention our group has felt that variable rent, the variable rent cap might be a better way to go, or it would be for a couple reasons. But I had mentioned with this volatile market we see right now, our housing market and the economy, tying that to a fixed rate is going to put people in a tight position if they're already, on the edge there, or if they want to be able to stay above water, basically. And then the concern would be then we might lose those rental properties. And I think it was also mentioned that, with the fixed cap, it really puts all rental property owners in the same category. And that is a challenge because, different rental property owners have different resources. So, our consensus was that the variable rate was probably the better way to go, especially considering repairs that might come up or other costs that might happen where, all of a sudden you've got a huge cost and you can't keep up with whatever inflation has been on goods, a new roof, whatever that might cost. And lastly, I'll just say that we talked a bit about just how interesting it was that some of the cities had the additional percentage above and beyond the variable rate or the inflation rate. And we were curious as to, if that was initially in the plan or if that was added later for those, rent stabilization efforts, and why they were added. So it was a good discussion in our group.
Thank you for that. Two?
I think Robbie said most of what our group were talking about already. I think our concern is really that with inflation, hard 3% cap it doesn't really make sense. I think it will disincentivize investors to invest in our community. And that's something that we need to also make it easier for investors to come and invest. But at the same time, we don't want price gouging, right? So we think some type of variable or tied to the consumer index or some type of index plus some percentage will make more sense than just a flat percentage cap.
Thank you for that. Cecile?
Thanks. We didn't come to our conclusion as our group necessarily, but we talked about how the 3% cap provides some predictability for renters. I think we had more questions about what the unintended consequences were and the fact that a 3% cap doesn't really, can't predict those costs that a landlord will incur that they can't necessarily control. Tax increases, insurance, utilities, labor costs, like we're seeing now with the Great Resignation, and that if they don't have a way to make that up or pass it along, things are not going to happen. So roofs won't get fixed, maintenance will go down, security will go down, and the concern is that people will just take what they can out of the property and then just let it go. And then properties could get upside down, like they have happened with the mortgage foreclosure crisis, et cetera. So those are some of the things we talked about.
Okay, I see we got a lot of hands still and we're trying to take a break. So we're going to just get to these last three and then we're going to take a break. So Richard?
Hi, I think probably like most groups, we talked about the advantages and disadvantages of fixed versus variable. But one of the questions we sort of brought up was, what should we be thinking about as our overall goal here, right? Are we trying to avoid rent gouging? Are we trying to make sure that tenants have a very stable and consistent increase in rents every year? How can we balance that with needs of housing providers as well? So,
okay, Ivory and then B.
Yeah, one of the things we came upon is what are these kind of objections to the flat rate? How are they not already solved by the exemption process that's currently written into the policy? And why is there a need to re-architect the policy when landlords already have a way to adjust for costs that may arise that are unpredictable. Another thing to keep in mind is that our current housing market is not the housing market we will always have. And we do not see rents go down necessarily when landlord costs go down. So that's one thing I want folks to keep in mind. And the last thing is that we're trying to solve for displacement, and we're trying to solve for keeping St. Paul folks in their homes. And investment in St. Paul is a tertiary goal, I think, in our mind. It's always a worthwhile one, but there are people in St. Paul that are being pushed out of St. Paul. And that's the folks that we're really trying to push this policy to serve.
And B.
Yeah, just to add on to that, so many of the people that we talked to have just been like, you know, they can't stay in their community, they can't stay in St. Paul, they've been displaced to other cities. And so I don't know how we can necessarily invest in our community when the community is starting to move away because they can't afford to live here. And so I think when we're talking about investment in community, we also need to talk about that and how we're going to make sure that these folks stay on. And I think that predictability with the 3% cap is just going to be crucial. I think no matter what, if you have a mortgage, yes, there's going to be some fees, there's going to be things that come up. However, you will always have that predictability on your hand. And why can't renters have the same thing? Why can't renters necessarily have that on their side as well? And I also think that when it comes to being a housing provider or a landlord or whatever you want to call it, it is your job to make sure that that property is up to date and that that property is safe and a good place to live. And it is the law for you to make sure that that happens. So I don't necessarily see that rent control or rent stabilization being the reason why property value goes down, because it shouldn't. It is your job to make sure that it stays that way. And I think we even have a whole commission in the city of St. Paul to make sure that homes and houses in St. Paul are up to code with everything that's going on. And I think even with or without a rent stabilization policy, there are still a number of renters who stories you don't hear, that they don't have a clean toilet, that they don't have a clean shower, that their roof is leaking and nothing is being done about it. So these issues are already present. The issues of the value of this homes not being taken care of is already an issue with or without the policy. And if that is your incentive for not wanting to pass a policy, then I think we need to talk about why that is. And I mean, even with these unfortunate things happening to these homes, their rents are still going up, and their issues are being ignored, and nobody's coming to their rescue to make sure that they're okay when that's their job. And so I'm just curious as to what that can look like if we just have a variable rate. It's like, we need to make sure that we stick with this 3% cap. And again, I listed the reason why. It's because a lot of the people that are experiencing an extreme rent hike are those people of color, those Black people, those indigenous households. And we know that from talking to these folks, that they're like, I have not seen my landlord in months. They have not fixed anything in my home, yet my rent went up $300. Why is that? And why do we continue to have these conversations if we're not looking at it through that lens? I think when we start looking at housing as a business deal, or if we look at housing as something that's not as important, I think that's when we start to lose focus as to St. Paul being a community and people wanting to come live in St. Paul, because then we're not, this is housing. This is where people come to unwind, to be themselves, and to just live. And it's not a business deal. It's these people's livelihoods. And I think we need to remember that. And we need to remember that this is also a racial issue. It is not a coincidence that a lot of the people who are experiencing extreme rent hikes are people of color and Black people. That is very intentional. And I think we need to recognize that as we have these conversations. And that is why that 3% cap is important. For the last time, it is because those households are the ones suffering the most. And if we start to ignore that, then I do start to have some issues as to why folks were allowed into this group. And I think we need to also understand that. And I'm done. I think we're ready for break because I'm just
okay. B, and like I said, Adam, I'm going to move it back to you. B, I respect, obviously you're very passionate about your views, and I'm my life's work is around creating equity and stuff, but let's try to keep our comments concise, because I think once we get into it, I think some of us are polarized on one end of this or the other, and we're starting to repeat facts, which in the interest of having a group of 41 is very hard. I think on some of the things they're saying, I think we're going to want to go back and fact check some of these things as well, because there may be difference of opinions being to that. I think
I will say that while a lot of things might not be concise, these are stories directly from renters. These are not just stories that I'm pulling out of thin air. These are stories of renters that I talked to specifically, and so many people in this commission talked to specifically. And we should also be looking at those. Research and data to an extent shares that, but there are still so many people who are being left out of the conversation when it comes to research and data, and we need to make sure we allow those to be intact as well. So I'm sorry, that's all I'm going to say. I'm going on break.
Right. And like your point is well taken. I think one of the things that's not being said here is, when we look at equity in this country, like whose job is it? And I think that we have to wholly look at how we invest in equity. Again, property taxes and home values are tied to the renters because you can't, it's a rate of return. So to say that it's not related is not factual true. But there may be other ways that we can protect renters as well with rent control, with different subsidies. We know my personal opinion is as a country, we need to invest in communities of color, and we should not have this issue that we have right now with this poverty. How we solve that is a whole nother question. And there's a lot of ways to do it. And I think, first and foremost, that we shouldn't mix those two things up. And just because you're against rent control doesn't mean that you're against equity. And just because you're for rent control doesn't mean that you are anti-establishment. So let's keep this respectful. Edward, I know we have 2 more questions, but I really would like to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll kick off. And if you guys can hold that thoughts. Again, it's very, very passionate, which I get. And I think it's very hard. And I think a lot of people on here, if you work in communities of color and your family's been through some of these things, it is traumatizing. And I'm sure there's some people that own apartments here that spend a lot of money on them and make sure that they're, really great and have great experiences. And it's not fair that we're bundling you in. But at the same time, there's a lot of people with lived experience of what they've gone through in their own lives. I think a bigger question here is, and maybe outside of this thing is, how do we protect individuals as a whole to make sure that, our business is being done properly and everybody has safe, affordable place to live at quality. So with that, I want to, Philip, do you have anything to add before we go on break?
Nope. Let's break.
Okay.
Is anyone from Cura able to go in a breakout room quick? I have a question.
I'm happy to do that, Ed. Okay, so just me and you're just saying, Ronson?
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Okay, I'll set that up and we'll kick that off in just a second.
Thank you.
Sorry, Ronson, I'm trying to figure out how to not open every single breakout room and instead just a room for you and I. Give me 1 second.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I think we've decided we're going to try to table some of these questions till the next possible break, just on time. I do think something that came up, and B, we really appreciate, your comments. And, I'm going to suggest that at some point, and I don't know if it's in our scope of work, that maybe we get together a couple subcommittees where we can have members here, present internally on as the experts in the city. And I know I'm going off script a little bit here, but I do think when we have people's voices that they want to be heard, and then it becomes it's not always just the question that we're asking, but all your lived experience is important for everybody. So we have builders, we have homeowners, we have tenants, we have community members. And so I know that we're listening to a lot of data here, but I'm going to suggest that we work into our program one of these days on a allotted time where maybe we put 3 or 4 people that want to be on a subcommittee on why this is important to them on a couple different categories, and we can present out to the group so people feels that their voices are heard. And that way we don't have to, as always, like people need to find space to make sure that we're getting the full story.
I have to disagree with that. If you cannot have an uncomfortable conversation about the hardships that people are facing in St. Paul, then why did you join this task force? I think that if you are uncomfortable with me getting upset about what is going on in St. Paul, I don't understand then why we're having these conversations.
Well,
I'm
trying to facilitate 41 people. And what I'm actually saying is I want to give a space for you to have that conversation so we can all listen and follow a script and a timeline so everybody can speak. So I'm actually saying that your point of view is very important, but I want it to be heard thoroughly. And I want others that share your opinion to actually let you, who is an expert in the ground, to present to the whole group. So I'm not trying to cut you off. I'm not trying to be, it's not uncomfortable conversation. I'm trying to follow the timelines and the guides in our
No, you're not. No, you're not.
One of the rules we said is, go ahead, Clara.
One of the rules we said that we'll be able to tell our stories and be vulnerable telling our stories, not to interrupt those stories. That's why we're here. We don't need to join a subcommittee. We was here to join a committee to talk. And when we start talking, you guys start interrupting us. These ain't no opinion. These are facts. And then you question the facts that we say. Why are we here? We're not pawns here. We're not here to negotiate. We're here for you guys to listen to what we're saying, why we need an increase of 3% rent cap. But we're being interrupted. We're not here to just be listeners. We're here to have a say so. My name is upset right now because you won't let Brian finish the story. And Tony, you got to be fair. A facilitator don't interrupt the speaker and let him tell his story. Let us tell our stories.
So what I hear Tony saying is that we want to make sure that we have the time and the plan in our agenda to do that. And I also think I was going to jump in with an additional suggestion. We have, I think it was in the go through that Ed went through in the first meeting of our kind of overall scope of work to do some public engagement. And I think, I don't know if this can happen this week, but at some point in the next couple of weeks in the survey tool that the Cura staff send out, I think it would be really helpful to solicit the input of everybody who's in this task force in terms of how you think it will be most effective to do that, to make sure that we are really grounding the deliberations when we get there in a few weeks in the real lived experience and stories of people in the city. So with that, I think we would like to return to our content for the rest of today's meeting. We are pretty far behind the schedule we set out, and we're going to have a lot of time for deliberation together. We want to get a baseline established from the research first.
Thank you, Philip. And Ed, moving on, and I do apologize, B, if I was cutting you off. I'm also thinking of the interests of the whole group, and that's why I'm trying to find more time to be able to listen to you as well as go through the agenda. So, Ed?
Okay, thank you, Tony, and thank you, members of the task force. I'm going to try to pick up my pace perhaps a little bit more so that we can get through the learning stage and get to a point in these conversations that I think people really want to get to. So our second topic when it comes to program designs is the question of decontrol. And so let's spend some time talking about that. There are several ways that programs have incorporated decontrol in the past. This refers to a situation in which a housing unit goes from being rent regulated to being unregulated. And this can happen either temporarily or permanently. And it generally happens in a couple of different ways. The first one is permanent control. This is removing a unit from rent regulation based on some kind of occurrence or some kind of event. This doesn't happen a lot, this kind of permanent decontrol, because of course it immediately reduces the stock of rent regulated units. While it was used more frequently in early programs, it's hard to find examples of permanent decontrol in many of the programs that exist currently. What's much more common is a temporary kind of decontrol, and one that is triggered when there is a vacancy in the unit. And so this is called full vacancy decontrol, which is when a tenant vacates the unit and moves out, the property owner is given the opportunity to raise rents without any cap at all. And then the rent regulations resume in subsequent years. So in that tenant's second year, the cap is reinstituted, the cap on the rent increases. It is just for that transition period where there was a vacancy that the owner is allowed the opportunity to increase rents back up in an unlimited fashion. A third approach is what's called partial vacancy decontrol. And this is a situation where when a vacancy occurs, the property owner can raise rents above the cap, but not in an unlimited fashion. So for example, the District of Columbia used to cap it at 30%. Now the district permits a 10% increase upon vacancy if the previous tenant lived in the unit for less than 10 years. If the previous tenant lived in the unit for more than 10 years, the District of Columbia allows a 20% increase. So it's not an unlimited increase, but it is an increase above the cap that the city has in place. New York City had a system that tied the vacancy cap not to how long the previous tenant lived there, but how long the next tenant signed a lease for. So for example, there was a 20% increase allowed if the new tenant was signing a 2-year lease, but they allowed less of an increase for a 1-year lease. In any case, the point being here that the property owner is allowed to increase rents above the cap, but not in an unlimited fashion. And then finally, the city of New York had another type of decontrol, which was called luxury decontrol. This was a permanent form of decontrol that was ended in 2019, and it applied to units at the very high end, or the high end anyway, of the housing market. But that doesn't exist in New York City anymore, and I don't know of any other place where it currently does. I just give you that as a point of information. So what is the impact of vacancy decontrol? There's very little direct research on this question of what happens during decontrol. But some researchers impute effects. For example, there were 3 major studies of New Jersey cities done over the last 30 years, which in the end showed very little difference between rents in cities that had rent control and rents in other cities. And the authors suggested that it had to do with vacancy decontrol, that the turnover rate among tenants was sufficient enough that property owners were frequently increasing the rents back up to roughly a market level. So much so that you couldn't tell the difference really between cities that had rent control and cities that didn't. Another study in Berkeley, almost 10 years ago, took a look at tenants who had lived consecutively in their units since prior to 1999. They were paying an average rent of $780 a month. They compared those tenants to other tenants who were in rent-controlled units, but rent-controlled units that had turned over, and vacancy decontrol had allowed the property owners to increase rents. And the average rent that those households were paying was just about twice as much, $1,436 a month. So this gives, again, some evidence that vacancy decontrol makes a big difference in the prevailing rents. I mean, this is essentially how vacancy decontrol works. If you have a level of unregulated rents that go up over a period of time, and then what the regulated rents look like, right? So the line B here is the allowable cap under whatever the program cap is. Vacancy decontrol allows landlords at a time of vacancy to increase the rents back up to around what would have applied to an unregulated unit. And then for the period of time that tenant is in that unit, the rate of increase mirrors the rate of increase of regulated rents, right? Because the rent cap applies. And then when that tenant moves out, the property owner increases rents again, and then the cap applies for that period of time until that tenant moves out. And you can see how the process moves from place to place, and from tenant to tenant. So vacancy decontrol allows rents to move in this manner. There was a study of New York City actually that showed that it didn't work quite like this, but that in fact it worked a little bit like this, which is that upon decontrol, units were increased slightly above what unregulated units were being rented for. And then over a period of time, the savings occurred for the renter. And then upon the new vacancy, rates were increased again slightly above what the rest of the market was experiencing, et cetera, so that you had this kind of effect taking place. So this is how vacancy decontrol operates. And again, you have the choices of whether it's going to be unlimited or partial decontrol, or whether you have vacancy decontrol at all. There are a series of issues that are related to vacancy decontrol. Some people argue that it provides an incentive for property owners to evict tenants because that's the point of time during a vacancy when rents can be increased precipitously. I will say that many cities in New Jersey require property owners to obtain a statement from the tenant leaving that there had been no harassment in the move of that tenant. But I don't know of any research on this issue that addresses this issue of evictions related to decontrol. For the same reason, there is an incentive to the tenant to stay in the unit longer. because when that tenant, should that tenant move out and then try to find another unit, they will be looking at units that have been in essence deregulated for that period of time. So the savings doesn't occur at the time of getting the lease, it occurs over time. Vacancy decontrol is also seen as providing a disincentive for maintenance over time. This can happen in a couple of ways. Some people argue that vacancy decontrol disincentivizes maintenance as a way of encouraging tenants to move. There was a study of New York City that showed that when vacancy decontrol was instituted, there was a significant decline in capital improvements in the housing stock. Consistent with this, if you have vacancy control, which is that there is not the opportunity to raise it back to market levels, capital improvement pass-throughs can become one of the main ways that property owners can actually see higher rents. And so sometimes that incentivizes maintenance when you don't have vacancy decontrol. And then finally, I think some people argue that vacancy decontrol provides an incentive to property owners to take markets out of the rental market, that you would see greater conversion to condominiums or demolitions when there is not the prospect of decontrol back to market levels. But again, there is no research that I know of that directly assesses whether these incentives are actually in operation and make a difference in local markets. What are some examples of vacancy decontrol? Back in the 1980s, approximately half of the rent control programs that existed had some form of vacancy decontrol, but again, half did not as well. In 2017, the city of Newark, New Jersey, allowed vacancy decontrol up to 20% increases, but depending on how much the property owner spent to upgrade the units. So they tied the amount of the allowable increase to the amount that was being spent on the unit itself during the vacancy period. And as I mentioned, in New York City in 2019, they eliminated both their luxury decontrol and they eliminated the partial vacancy decontrol that they had. So again, this is a feature of rent control programs that varies from place to place, and it can be used in different ways. I was going to go to a breakout room at this point where we could discuss some of the issues of vacancy decontrol. I know that we have 15 minutes left, and I'm wondering whether people want to break out again so quickly, or whether we should try to make up some of the time with our next topic. Tony or Philip, I don't know what your sense is on this.
Well, I'm open to hearing from, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Tony.
Okay. I'm open to hearing if there's ideas. I don't know how much longer, what we're going to miss today. I think it's great when we can have small discussions and people could have conversations. And I think Tu just said that he wanted a breakout room. And so in the interest of time, if we're going to do that, let's do it right away. We just might have to push something back, and we can address this later as well.
Great. So while Tony Damiano is putting together the breakout rooms, I would just encourage you to talk about the trade-offs of vacancy control and decontrol. You might also think about what subgroup of renters would benefit most from having vacancy control. that is not being able to.
Right. So here's I want to say. So some of the people just want to have an open talk about it in the forum, and I want to get back to address something I said before. We have 41 people on here, and I'm volunteering to be on here. I don't have a horse in this race. I'm here to facilitate it. If I let everyone on here talk, that means we each get 3 minutes of meeting. If someone wants to talk for 20 minutes, that means 19 people don't get to talk. I'm not cutting people off. I'm trying to make sure that they're not cutting other people off. This is equitable. Again, I want everyone's voice to be heard. And when I think people's voice aren't heard, I try to make space for it at a different day. So again, let's try to be respectful of everybody. Let's understand we have a lot of voices here. I think the group says that we're willing to talk about this now instead of breakout rooms. So again, let's try to keep our comments to, what do we say, 2 minutes, 1 minute? We have 2 minutes. How many people can say what they want to say on here if that's the choice we want to make? It is very difficult to take 41 opinions and make a decision within 30 seconds. And I am doing the best I can as my other chair. So we will go forward talking about this in one large group so we can all hear opinions. But I want people to be mindful that we have 41 people on here and actually 8 minutes to hear all their opinions. All right, so Ed, let's facilitate hearing some opinions on this, but let's have people be respectful that we want to hear all the voices as well.
Okay. So shall we go to the hand? I see Chu's hand up.
Yeah, I just want to say I think that I would prefer vacancy decontrol. There's a cost involved during turnovers. It's a 3% cap with inflation at 7.5%, plus the rise of property taxes, inflation. Landlords are already going to get squeezed out. At the end of the day, this is a business. No matter if you like that or not, it's a business. People have put in their life savings into these properties. And so we need to make sure that tenants have stability while they're living there, but also make sure that landlords stay in St. Paul, investors continue to stay in St. Paul. So that's my point of view.
Okay, thank you. I see D'Angelo's next.
Yeah, I think for the sake of everyone, I think it'd be really important for us to spend some time reviewing the actual ordinance, because it seems like people, as part of these conversation topics, are missing that what's actually in the proposed ordinance. So for instance, a lot of the costs associated can be increased above 3% if simply the landlord can present their case as part of the exemptions, right? And so I think we are muddying the water of what's already in the ordinance versus what we're discussing for educational purposes. And so at some time, I hope everyone spends time to read the 2-page ordinance as is, so that in these discussions, it's fruitful for us to talk about what's actually needs to be added versus what's already addressed.
All right, thank you, D'Angelo's. Marcus.
Thank you. I'm here to address, Chu had a good point, but I'm on the other spectrum of that. Consequences. My neighbor upstairs, our fourplex just got bought in November. He raised everybody's rent. We're all leaving. My neighbor upstairs, myself, we're longtime West Siders since the 70s. So we're basically being bought out and forced out of our own communities. So the consequences, you're destabilizing cultures. Like my guy upstairs, he's the nephew of someone I went to school with, and his uncles and aunts, and I know their parents and their grandparents. Well, now with the nephew being forced out, like myself, you're destabilizing culture and what we bring to our communities. So I'm against that too. I understand the business part of that, but for those like B mentioned, the people we're talking to doesn't seem to be the people you guys are talking to. So, but we all can come together and come up with some kind of equitable solution. I think we have to. So hopefully this group will be able, when it's all said and done, our end game is to come up with a viable solution. No one's going to be happy, but at least make it palatable, where we all can, the people can make their money, the renters can afford what we can afford to stay in our own communities, in our own backyards. So I'm hoping that's the solution we come to at the end of this 4 months. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcus. I don't see any other hands. Do you, Tony?
I do not.
There was a question in the chat previously from Bill that says, asking about cities without vacancy decontrol. How do landlords with vacant units decide who gets to live there? Are there waiting lists or are there other methods?
I'm not sure I can answer that question. Let's put that on the list of things to try to investigate. Cecile, your hand.
I thought some of the things you presented, Ed, were kind of interesting around vacancy decontrol, that it's not an all or nothing, but there's a way to provide some room, for example, let's just say, for example, the 3% stays there, but in our region, we have seen taxes, insurance, and utilities go up a lot more. That there might be an interesting way to provide for vacancy decontrol that doesn't gouge the tenant, but allows landlords to recapture some of that, as opposed to going all the way to market. I hadn't heard of that. I thought that was kind of interesting, because I can see how landlords would do that if costs have gone up and they haven't been able to recoup those at all through rent increases. So I thought it was worth discussing and reviewing.
Okay. All right. Thanks. All right. Oh, Kyrie.
I think one thing I'd like to understand more from the advocates that like cards on the table, I'm sympathetic to vacancy decontrol, is what I've heard is that that the cap increases stability for tenants long term and allows them to plan for staying in their homes over the course of 3, 5, however many years. How tenants are impacted then if they're voluntarily leaving a unit, and I would want to put that qualifier in the case that they're voluntarily leaving the unit, how that same tenant would be impacted if the unit were then able to go to a unregulated rent afterward.
I'm sorry, Kyrie, I didn't quite hear you the entire time. Was there a question there for me?
Sorry, I was on the wrong mic. I apologize. Okay. So what I heard earlier is that having a cap creates stability for tenants over the long term because they can plan for how their expenses are going to increase over a longer period of time. What I'd like to understand from some of the advocates is how that same tenant who was able to have the stability of a regulated unit for a number of years would then be impacted if the unit or the house were able to go to a different rent, back to the market rent after that tenant, once again, the qualifier being voluntarily leaves.
I can answer that. The concern is that tenants are forced out. They're not voluntarily leaving. So the concern is that maintenance is that landlords choose to defer maintenance. That policy doesn't make people defer maintenance. That landlords choose to defer maintenance, knowing that tenants often have little or less ability to fight deferred maintenance because of costs of legal assistance and things like that. Till they leave, they can make it unpleasant to be there, engage in harassment, retaliation, things like that. And those are things that have happened in other cities, which is one reason that vacancy decontrol was put into this policy. So things that people point to as things that haven't been successful about similar policies in the past were solved for by having vacancy decontrol in this policy.
So as a quick follow-up question, then would you have the same concern if you had the right to renewal that we had in the tenant protection ordinances, if that were still active? This is hypothetical. Would you have that same concern if a tenant had the right to just cause eviction then? Would you have the same concern for vacancy decontrol?
I think that's a good question, one I'd want to think about a little bit more, but I think that a just cause provision along with rent stabilization would provide deeper stability for tenants, if that's the question.
It is the case that many cities do couple just cause eviction ordinances with rent stabilization that incorporates vacancy decontrol for that purpose. D'Angelo.
Yeah, and so I just want to elevate, like, we're talking about 1 foot of the equation regarding the policy, but the current ordinance has some definitions that are yet to be determined that would really anchor us in this conversation. One around rent is not defined as what is rent supposed to cover by the tenant, and leaving it to tenant landlord interactions won't be favorable over the long term for tenants. And then also, what is that definition of reasonable rate on return, or how is that going to be determined? Because the provision, as I stated in the chat, covers a lot of reasons why a landlord can increase rent or make the case to the city or some kind of third party on why the rents can be increased based on reasonable rate of return definition that is yet to be defined. And so I know that's a part of our work, I believe, to get to that topic, but I think we're having only one half of the conversation, and it's hard for us to answer the complete story here.
So I will say that the slide you see on your screen shows that our next topic is this very thing. What are the exceptions to the cap? Pass-throughs, what are they allowed for capital improvements? How have cities used this idea of reasonable return, et cetera? And I do think that some of the issues that we're having in your conversation is that we haven't quite covered all of the topics that are relevant. It's hard to do that all at once. And every time we do talk of a topic, it does bring up interesting considerations. And so having that at the same time that we're learning about it is just makes the process that much more interesting. I also see that my clock says 2:57. So I think instead of launching on the next topic, I will hand it back to Tony.
Philip is back as well. I know we're running out of time. A lot of emotions are here. Again, I just want to reiterate, no disrespect intended to anybody. I'm sorry if people felt like they are cut off. We are, and I am, and Philip, we're trying to do the best we can with understanding that we have 41 people to listen to, and we're falling behind on this agenda. As you saw, Philip wrote in there, we're not in a hurry, right? Because we have until November. This isn't a May 1st deadline that we have to beat. So we want to make sure that we really spend a lot of time educating ourselves and then coming together as a group and figuring out what works. And we're not saying that the current law doesn't work or that there's changes. We're saying is let's hold some of these comments until we all listen to each other. If we don't feel like there's enough space for people, let us know. And this is where I didn't mean making subcommittees to more committees. I just meant to create more space for people to tell their stories and give them more time to share their views with the groups. I appreciate everybody here. We know everyone's volunteering and a lot of people are here on the behalf of others. Which we really appreciate that, because to give when you have no self-interest is a great thing. And at the end of the day, the community has to figure out a way to work together to be cohesive. So Phil, do you have anything to add?
Thanks, Tony. Just noting D'Angelo's comment there. I think that's a really good suggestion that we'll follow up on between meetings. And yeah, thank you everybody for the passionate discussion and engagement. We'll see you next Tuesday.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone.
Take care.